You and your boys are going to have quite a fight when you come on in April. And by 2007, 2008, the Taliban and the syndicate of all these other different groups are ratcheting up the violence very significantly, all along that border, but then also around Kandahar, and then clearly down in Sangin and Helmand province.
We have with us today retired Major General Jeffrey Schloesser, author of Marathon War, Leadership in Combat in Afghanistan. He is the retired commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division and commanded the 101st Airborne Division's combined joint task force in Afghanistan for 450 days. He helped create and publish the National Military Strategic Plan for the Global War on Terrorism. We talk about 9/11, aftermath, how did America respond, early Iraq days, 2003 and 4, leadership at its highest levels, and finally, Afghanistan. Was it all worth it?
Coming to David in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and cue David.
Hey, sir, appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, David, thanks for having me.
Well, I read your book. I only have about 300 things to say. Number one, you moved a lot.
That's true.
Like really a lot. And I'm not talking like down the block. We're talking coast to coast, country to country. I mean, that was a very active, many decades you had there.
Yeah, talk to my kids about it or my wife. They'll tell you the truth, yeah.
Well, you know, I remember one, and totally just reminded me, one line in the book, something about one movie you were going to make, and you sat with your wife and you talked about, should we leave the kids, should we not take them? Yeah. And you guys made the decision to move as a family unit, huh?
Yeah, it happened actually twice. Once with my son going to Germany, and of course, he was supposed to go and spend all of his high school time alone, you know, in one school. Never happened. So he was a junior, moving for the senior time. We went and said, I got orders for Germany, and he goes away for a little bit, comes back and says, let's go. And I find out later it's the drinking age. He was ready to, yeah. And our daughter, we gave her the choice of either moving from Germany later to Kuwait or staying in Germany and try to finish off school there. And she said, no, we'll go to Kuwait as a family. So both children, they're hardcore Army brats. There's no doubt about it. Wow. Or military brats.
That takes a special family.
It does.
So if somebody told you when you were a young PFC that you were one day going to do what you did and command at the level you did in Afghanistan, what would you have said?
I've said, you really are crazy. And yeah, there was no thought of that when I was a youngster, obviously. And I would have said, you are crazy. Yeah.
So do you think the Army and maybe the military in general does a good job at, as you grow in rank, loading you with more responsibility, kind of weeding out those that aren't fit for it, and then just growing at those certain levels?
Certainly in my time, that's what I think happened. I mean, there's no doubt, either as a young private, you know, I mean, one of the first responsibilities I had was actually becoming an acting squad leader, and I was still a PFC. I mean, and that was just, you know, kind of a crazy thing. But all the way through, I think so. You know, they also have a different part of that too, David, is not only do you grow in responsibility and the idea of what leadership actually is and then experiencing it and doing it, but they also throw a few things out there to keep your interest. You know, there's no doubt.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, either new schools or things of that nature. You know, I don't think that I would have stayed as I started off once I was an officer as a combat engineer, and I had a great mentor who basically said, you don't have a professional engineering degree, you know, you ought to be thinking of other things. You know, you're doing very well, but the long-term prognosis in the Corps of Engineers is you've got to have a professional degree.
Interesting.
And so I finally went to flight school. I mean, you know, in fact, it was with
because it would be harder to get promoted at the higher ranks without it.
Yeah, you know, I would have had to go on to school, and to be truthful, my background was mainly in social, you know, types of studies and stuff like that at the great University of Kansas, where I did go to school. And I think it worked out better. But they also then down the road, you know, I was taking some courses while I was at Fort Hood late at night, driving to Austin to go to the University of Texas in a master's degree. Because there's this period of time in which to be a successful officer, in theory, you had to have a graduate degree. Well, it really probably wasn't true, but I was taking some courses, and the Army calls up and it goes, "You're crazy." They said, "You have a great GPA from your bachelor's degree. We're going to send you to school." And so they sent me to Georgetown for a 2-year master's degree program. And plus they sent me to go study Arabic for a year. Well, when that was done, though, I owed the Army like 9 years, right? So there was that little thing that they kind of waive and stuff. Later on, instead of going to Army War College, they said, "You're going to go to Harvard and be a national security fellow." Again, there's always a payback, and I don't regret anything,
But you knew what you were getting yourself into.
You
right?
absolutely do.
Yeah, right.
But so they give you opportunities to broaden yourself is the right term, and I did use those. I took those opportunities to try to be.
So that actually brings me to the first point I was going to make, hearing you say that, because when I was reading your book, at least the first couple of chapters, it was almost like you were being groomed or mentored or very much selected for certain paths that just led you down this career that maybe gave you the true experience to do what you had to do later in your career. Did any of that resonate with you at the time?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there was a time when I was in the middle of my favorite aviation unit at the time, which was the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. You know it well from your background.
Shout out to the Night Stalkers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was there as a captain, and I got a call. I mentioned this in Marathon War, the book. I got a call from the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and in fact, I mean, I didn't even believe I didn't even know who the Vice Chief was. I mean, the truth was, I mean, and our clerk was a PFC at the time and had a wicked sense of humor. He turns out to later be a command sergeant major, by the way, down the road. But he comes in and he says, "Sir, you need to call the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army." And I go, "And here's a number," and I go, "Yeah, right. I was born yesterday, born in the day, but not yesterday." Anyway, later he comes in and goes, "No, you better call. This is serious." And so I called up, and eventually they had identified me, and my first mentor was actually the XO to the Vice Chief. Anyway, to make a long story short, what they said is we're envisioning a time in the world where the Middle East is going to be a real issue.
Interesting.
We know you like to lead, because I've said that many times, that the primary reason why I stayed in the military was to be a leader, right? It wasn't to be an aviator, it wasn't to be a combat engineer, it wasn't to be a Middle East specialist or a strategist or a counterterrorist, which is eventually what I become. It was to lead. And to make a long story short, they said, "We were going to send you to school. We're going to send you to Georgetown, or the best school you can get into. We want you to go in an immersive one-year program."
What time frame is this?
So this is in 1985.
Oh, wow.
86. Yeah, so this is, for many listeners, viewers, that was probably before they were born. But I was a captain, right? And I'd already made 1 or 2 career decisions. I mean, it was, I could have got out of the Army as a combat engineer successfully after basically 4 years, and plus my enlisted time. But I chose to go into aviation. Then I was thinking, well, I'm about done here. I can get out of the Army after about 3 years. And I got in this new outfit called the 160th, right, the Special Ops. And that was in 83, 84. And that kept me in the Army for longer. And then this opportunity comes really too fast for me, to be quite frank. But that was a very deliberative process where they were trying to get somebody that was comfortable in the Middle East, comfortable in the cultures, would travel widely, but also would be a leader.
So at the time, was it these are just good opportunities, or did you feel like it was going to lead towards something bigger down the road? Maybe you didn't know what, but it was going towards something.
Yeah, I felt at that time, that I had a distinct possibility of at least commanding at a couple different levels that I initially didn't think would happen, based upon those experiences and those. It really is a series of years of being mentored by a very senior person, Max Thurman, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Later goes on and commands as a combatant commander in Southern Command during the Panama invasion. But I distinctly felt then that somebody was watching over me. Now, I could screw up clearly that whole thing if I had done some missteps. It really didn't change me, David. I mean, I always tell people, don't look at my career as a model. It's very eclectic, right? I did a whole bunch of different things. In many cases, I was wanting to have fun. And in many cases, I mean, as an adult, I would say being fulfilled, being rewarded, being at the time an overworn phase was be all you could be, right? And I thought I was trying to do that. I mean, I was just, a youngster coming in the Army. I've got photos with PFC stripes on me and no hair, right? So
speaking of that, if I could read this from your book real quick, because this was the first kind of eye-opening, one of them, you'll see in a second, Chapter 2, page 25. We're talking about right post 9/11. That day, he told me I was going to start a new planning cell on the Joint Staff to plan what was to be a global war on terrorism, the GWAT. I had no charter, so I was to write one and brief it in 2 days. After over a year of coordination, in 2002, we published the National Military Strategic Plan for the Global War on Terror. Can I tell you how I took that?
Yeah, please.
Just as a, layman's terms, I'm on my couch, probably smoking a cigar, reading your book. You're over here doing some cool stuff in Kuwait, I think it was.
Yeah, Kuwait.
9/11 happened. America and we got punched in the gut. You fly back, and they're like, "Hey Jeff, we're going to do this thing called Global War on Terror. This is very new to us. We don't really have a plan. Go figure it out. Good luck." I mean, and I say that jokingly, of course, sir, but I mean, from the mindset, the approach, we don't need to get into classified stuff, obviously, but what was that like for you, and how did you even approach this?
Yeah, I had spent some time bashing terrorists, as in my, as far as in my jobs before that. They were very direct jobs. But I'd also spent a fair amount of time studying terrorism, both in school at Georgetown, later at Harvard. And I felt like intellectually I was prepared for a task of that nature. Now,
interesting.
What was the challenge is trying to figure out exactly what America wanted to do. We had some very broad statements from President Bush. I had direct access to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Rumsfeld, as well as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Myers, and of course my boss was General Abizaid at the time, and later General Casey. I felt like I had that access, but what they were really looking for was a plan and a strategy.
A plan to go attack the enemy?
Well, yes, and who was the enemy? And that's why you come up with this issue of global war on terror. It was very clear that the President and the Secretary of Defense saw a broader mission set than just going to Afghanistan and destroying or decimating the Al-Qaeda there. They saw it in broader terms. They saw if 9/11 could happen on our soil, then mainly transnational terrorists were an existential threat to America and our way of life. And the deeper that they got into it and the why of what happened, what was Osama bin Laden and his team there, what were they trying to do to America? The more that they got into that, started thinking through that, the more, I would say, concerned, anguished they became. And thus you see this broadening from well beyond Afghanistan. And what we do over a period of time is really look worldwide, what is the potential threat? Where are transnational terrorists, especially ones connected to Al-Qaeda? And then what can we do to either destroy them, decimate them? At the same time, we're trying to think about how do you change the narrative? How do you change their narrative where they're able to attract people? And so you get this whole, basically it's almost an information war.
What were some things you can say about bin Laden and why he planned the attacks on 9/11?
I think he was attacking our economy and our way of life is what he really wanted to have happen. There's a lot of concern. He basically, there's also a direct issue with Saudi Arabia that we don't want to get into a lot of detail on. But I think that what he saw is that if we would take a major role in that area of the world, that it would turn potential allies against us, the Saudis, the Gulfies, and things of that nature. But more importantly, he wanted to bleed us. He wanted to bleed our economy, and I think he was, in some cases, very wise as far as if you put on his sandals and his robe and things of that nature. He was no dummy. He was not a dumb person. Yeah, very intelligent person. He had long thought through this, and the whole movement had.
So did 9/11 then, as I hear you speak, you studied it for years prior. Obviously, it's now in the spotlight, but was there not as much focus on global terrorism prior to 9/11, and the 9/11 was the catalyst that said, okay, these guys are the real deal?
Yeah, no, there had been a lot of studies, and I had a lot of studies prior to 9/11 happening, and then of course, Americans have to be led sometimes to a conflict. We don't generally, in spite of our reputation now over the last 20 or 30 years, habitually, if you look in history, we had to be led to it. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt had to lead America to get involved in World War II for sure.
Interesting.
Right?
Good point.
And in this case, it's the very similar thing. If you go backwards and you think of the bombings that took place basically in Africa, Al Qaeda sponsored. If you took a look at the Cole bombing, of the ship there in the port of Aden, those were all things coming along. And by then, Osama bin Laden had already gone on record publicly and said he's at war with America. But it took 9/11 for us to take that seriously. There were other, transnational terrorist units or groups throughout the world that were doing similar things. Indonesia, Bali, things of that nature that were, doing bombings and things of that nature. Obviously, Africa, we really didn't focus on Africa terrorism until those bombings took place, and I would just say that there was a lot of intellectual study of it, in the universities and things like that, but the U.S. military at that point in time was not focused on terrorism to the broadest extent. You had the units like Delta and obviously the 160th and other units, SEAL Team 6 and things of that nature. But most of other folks were broadly looking at other portions of warfare.
During your year or so of putting this strategic plan together, were there some major eye-opening, like aha moments for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of and this is still has currency today, is that as we're going through this interviewing, talking to State Department, CIA, a whole bunch of characters out there that are helping us do this. Everybody kept reminding me at the very senior leaders of, say, the agency, they would say, okay, you're focused on B team. Don't forget that A team is Hezbollah and the Quds force and the Iranian proxy forces out there. They're the A team. Watch them. And that was an aha moment, because we were going through this entire process of really focusing on transnational terrorism, but yet state-sponsored terrorism coming out of Iran. That our plans really didn't take that and direct that in any specific way that would have been notable at that time.
Pure curiosity, did you focus on any of how these terrorist groups get all their funding? Was that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, we worked very closely with, by then, there was the nascent portion of an idea that terrorist financing was going to be a critical area of actually fighting terrorists. And you see Justice and Treasury working together to set up basically an anti-terrorism financing outfit that's actually trying to follow the money.
Interesting.
And so, in fact, a good friend of mine, Juan Zarate, eventually takes that over, and then eventually goes and works for the White House on counterterrorism. But absolutely, financing was considered early on as an area to work on. It took a while, though, to operationalize that.
And then how about, I think you briefly touched on about understanding their ideals and their core beliefs. Did you try to tap into that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And so state stands up this whole thing. I mean, the military really didn't see that as something that, we would use our units, either psychological warfare units really, or information warfare units. We didn't see that as our place, but we clearly saw that as trying to coordinate that. And so state takes that on as a major issue. And then later on, when I'm at the National Counterterrorism Center, they're up and running. Now, I got to say, in hindsight, we were less than successful, right? If you look backwards at that, I mean, we have not been as successful as I know all of us thought we could be in doing that, countering the message of terrorists.
Well, we're going to come back to that, actually. I'm glad you say that. I want to fast forward a little bit. You're in Iraq now.
Okay.
2003. Deputy Commander of the 101st Airborne Division, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Right under General Petraeus.
Yes.
And you wanted to lead a division in combat.
I did.
You did. Why?
It is like a self-fulfilling, I think by that time I thought that there had never been a command period that I did not enjoy. There were a variety of different types of outfits. And the truth is, I used to tell a story is I would rather command a mess kit repair. If you don't know what a mess kit is, you don't need them now. But something of that, a mess kit repair company. I'd rather lead that than be a staff puke someplace, right? I'm just being blunt with you, David. I always felt that way, right? And so being a commander was self-fulfilling. And it's not that I was arrogant. I tried to be actually a modest commander in all my commands because I realized where I came from. came from modest means. I'm not, don't come from wealth. Our families are lower middle class, both my wife's and mine, and yet it was self-fulfilling. It was rewarding beyond explanation.
Do you think a lot of commanders that get to your level share that same feeling? Otherwise, maybe they wouldn't be there?
No.
Interesting.
I think that, I still think about 25% of the commanders that get to be commanders of that nature are uncomfortable with that level of command and don't feel rewarded about it, or they engage in all the activities of leadership with some amount of trepidation.
So a commander at that level, explain to our viewers real quick, and then I'm going to get into why I bring this up. Do you apply for that? Are you chosen? How do you get to that top level, especially like Iraq, the deputy commander of the 101st?
It is basically you're chosen for that. They're really commands of that nature. You're basically nominated by a small professional group of human resources. They're military. They're nominated, but you are eventually just chosen by the senior leadership of the Army. Very similar to any of the other services. When you command believe me, a nuclear carrier, it is not where you go and nominate yourself and say, "Hey, I'm ready to do this."
Could you turn it down if you wanted to?
You absolutely could, but I don't know many people that did turn it, in my day, that would turn down a potential to be an assistant division commander, deputy commander, a brigade commander, battalion commander, or eventually a division commander. I don't know of people that did that. And so hence, you do have people that either are unprepared for, don't feel comfortable commanding, they don't like the type of decisions that you have to make as a commander.
I have a lot of questions on that in a little bit here.
Yeah.
But if I can read one more.
Sure.
Sentence, page 26. I learned daily from him, General Petraeus. Correct. I learned daily from him about governance, the operational end of warfighting, and the necessity of a strong narrative that could be translated by the media and understood at home. Yeah. Translated by the media and understood at home, that strong narrative. What does that mean? Why? Who? How?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are always two audiences when you're in combat, right? There is your home audience. Well, there's probably more because you have your actual troops, but you have the enemy, and then you have yourself, your country, and your allies, and that's your public. In a democracy, it's the public. If they don't understand what's happening, then the ability to maintain their support through our elected leaders is in jeopardy. You could do it for a few years, maybe some would say even a decade. We've done that in Iraq and Afghanistan. But you can kind of see already, and you may be leading to that, David, down the road, but what you can see has happened in Afghanistan, happened once before in Iraq, and we went back into Iraq, is essentially a lack of staying power. In a environment where staying power is the most critical thing.
Interesting.
Okay, and so I think General Petraeus, he understood that. I mean, in many cases, as a one-star with him, and he's a two-star. One, he's already beyond. I already feel like we're still fighting tactical battles in and around Mosul, and he's already thinking about, okay, how do we bring governance, good governance, to this entire area, these provinces in the north of Iraq, and then how do you make sure that the American people are understanding that while it may look like a daily grind, what they see in the papers, what they hear on the TV and radio, is actually, it is the necessary portions of getting to a success. And I think he did that better than anybody, certainly in that time frame in Iraq, was actually talking about
What
that.
are steps you do to be better at that? Are you personally doing media interviews? Are you helping craft the message?
So, I mean, some people, and many of my peers, even at the one-star level, much less the two-star, were uncomfortable talking to journalists, right? And he would flip that on his head, and I learned that in Iraq, and then I definitely did it in Afghanistan, where he would flip it on his head and say, you get used to talking to journalists. You're going to do it. That's part of your job description, right? And so it was like, Jeff, your job today is to go fly these journalists around and let them see what their soldiers are doing so that they can write things.
So they go back home, say, hey, I was just there, they write it up, and they get it out to the American public.
Absolutely. I mean, so the idea of an embedded journalist, really, you see that really happening, during our different forays into Iraq, both in this Desert Storm and then later on. But he took that to really a very significant extent. In other words, it wasn't just American journalists. If it was somebody from the French press, good, game on, let's go. And again, we weren't crafting a story. There was no intent of trying to basically, twist a story or make something that it wasn't. And in fact, he would often say is, give them the background and then get them on site on the ground with soldiers, and your soldiers are your best spokesman. And I found that the rest of my career.
Is that why you took in Afghanistan later on?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny because I still talk to a lot of those journalists that that I took out there on sites and stuff like that. And often, many cases, it was the soldiers that they talked to, or in many cases, airmen and sailors and others, because we had a combined force there. They're the ones who actually told the story that person wrote about when they sent an article back to, or did a film or whatever.
So very briefly, not too in depth, but paint the picture of 2003 Mosul. I was there too. Maybe we
I noticed that. Yeah.
But now we did Erbil, OIF-1, mainly Erbil area, and then but yeah, it was good. Yeah, beautiful scenery up there, parts of the world.
It is. It's stunningly beautiful. Yeah, no. But you guys at 10th Group did some awesome things.
We did. So. We had some good missions, but long story less long. I was on the team that arrested Saddam Hussein's brother. We actually thought it was Saddam Hussein, but that's a.
I know the background a little bit.
Yes,
yeah.
But so paint this picture for me, 2003 Mosul. I mean, there was no up armor Humvees at the time. At least we didn't have them. This was a very. Who were you guys fighting? What was your mission from high level?
Yeah, so it was interesting. It's funny because this is another thing about Dave Petraeus is that because I was late getting to the fight, I was still working on the Joint Staff, and I was having a real hard time getting out of the Joint Staff, right? And then finally I do, and I joined General Petraeus and the team there in late May, early June, and he's already called me once and said, "Don't bring any winter gear, Jeff. Yeah, we'll be out of here in 3 or 4 months." Things have really quieted down, right? And so I arrived there, and after about 30 days is when the things started happening. I'll never forget the 4th of July that night. My headquarters, as the DCGS, was at Mosul Airfield, and we started getting mortared right down, and they walked the mortars right down the runway, all the way into our forward area refueling point, which is where we had a number of people wounded. And I remember going back that evening late, probably about 2 in the morning, and saying, the character of the war just changed. And literally within weeks, you can see we're getting into daily scrapes, we're being shot at, attacked, snipers, and you're starting to see really these small groups, and they clearly have military capability. They clearly have military training. They're Iraqis that have, Iraqi army. They were not being paid on time. They don't see themselves. They're being disbanded. A lot of bad strategic decisions being made by, the multinational coalition there and the United States. And you start seeing them that we're starting to fight. And so we went from a period of about 30 days of calm when I get there to, after having fought, the division basically fought its way north, as you know, and did the longest air assault in history and things of that nature. But it was a coalition fight. There's no doubt the Marines were there, the Air Force was there, obviously, and clearly Special Operations folks there from the very start. It starts to go bad, basically. And at that time, we were starting to be attacked by IEDs, RPGs. And I remember, I'll never forget an afternoon where we had a Humvee that took a RPG and badly wounded the crew inside, but nobody was killed. And I'm out there studying essentially what an RPG looks like after it's fired. It looks like a little pipe, basically, and what it had done to the Humvee. And I'm going back to, I controlled the maintenance for the entire division, and I said, start welding on, I don't care where you get it, armor, fine armor, rip it off of, destroyed Soviet, whatever, vehicles, start welding them on Humvees. And within 2 months, David, we are welding armor onto vehicles, underneath seats. I mean, you just name it.
I remember putting sandbags on the floor of our Humvees. We did all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for, people that are viewing this, picture driving around like this, because the sandbags are double packed underneath, and you're sitting on it, and you're also got a piece of metal, which is not very comfortable, but it will protect some things. that you're sitting on. And so, America came to that war, I think, as the Secretary said, you come to wars with Secretary of Defense, with what it's a come as you are war. You don't get a chance to all of a sudden say, wait 2 years, I want to get a whole bunch of up-armored Humvees.
So did those up-armors, was that a result of the type of fighting we saw in country and things of that nature? And
eventually you can see that through, the whole progression then to the MRAPs, the basically the vehicles that were able to, save a number of different lives because of IEDs in the roads. Think of them, my dad did 3 tours in Vietnam, and I remember him talking about, he was in an armored cavalry outfit, and they would have their tanks and APCs, they would have mines in the middle of the road planted, and they would blow off the gears, and then they would get into a complex ambush. It really wasn't much more sophisticated than that in Iraq nor in Afghanistan. You had IEDs, many of them were command detonated, and then you would find yourself, into some sort of an ambush, and then maybe also with a follow-on command detonated IED. As soon as you did your first responder duties, rushed to the point of impact, tried to make sure that you could try to take care of the injured as best possible, and then boom, another ID would go off.
Kill zone.
Yeah.
So what tactics, techniques, procedures did you guys have to evolve those first? I mean, because that's a very unconventional war, and a lot of people were not ready for that.
Yeah, you're right. And so, in fact, I would dare say that General Petraeus takes the learning from that year and goes back, and he eventually goes, he serves again in Iraq, and then goes back to Leavenworth, where our doctrine center is, and he works with the Marine Corps, his counterpart, to write a new counterinsurgency doctrine. I would say that first year, what we are doing is we are doing everything we possibly can to learn about counterinsurgency, and so we're literally breaking up things that were my dad's doctrinal things, or the how-tos, the 3.0s, the FM 3.0s, field manual 3.0s, operations. We're going back. It's almost like it's back to the past to try to, because I think our Army actually did a purposeful forgetting after Vietnam. It was like, okay, that's over. It wasn't very good. Yeah. But we're going to go back to somebody like the Soviets. We're going to defeat the Soviets, something that we can possibly do on a more learned basis with, equipment and things like that. We tried to forget. I almost say if we didn't try to forget, we forgot insurgency and counterinsurgency after Vietnam. Now we're trying to relearn it, And so that was, for me, that was a year of learning, basically.
And in an urban environment, which is much different than we're going to get into. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So fast forward, we're now in Afghanistan. You took command of the 101st Airborne Division.
Right.
I remember reading part of the book. You woke up in the farmhouse, I believe, as you described it. It's the morning you're taking command. You're about to sip your coffee. How did that feel, taking command of that unit? That had to feel good. Yeah, so the farmhouse, just for everybody listening, is the designated quarters for the commanding general of the 101st. And it's like 10 acres of solitude, basically, right, with huge oak trees. And I go out there, and the sun's not quite up yet, and it's crisp. It's November. And a cup of coffee. I'm a coffee guy. And, and you go through this thing, are you prepared? And that's what those moments were. It could have gone by in about 5 minutes. It was long enough for my coffee to get cold, I know that. Did you get cold feet at all?
And no, I didn't. I mean, I'm a big runner. I love to run. I usually, used to run early in the morning. In fact, throughout the 101st for my time, I was known as a runner. I'd go out and run with the outfits, and then I would want to get another extra real 5 miles in or something like that. So I'd still run for another half hour, whatever. So the cold didn't bother me. But I was looking and going backwards and going, okay, are you ready for this moment? And at the end of the day, I mean, or at the end of that moment there, out there, or that time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I said, you're about as ready as anybody, and you're as ready as Jeff Schloesser's ever going to be, right? There's nothing more that I can do to be better at this point. And so it was also the time, and I took command 2 hours later, or 3 hours. In a sense, though, I took command at that time. At that, when I had that moment, the sun's coming up, I'm
mentally in the game. Was there a sense of pride? Did it feel, was it an internal accomplishment? We all get it when we do. I mean, that had to have been just a sense of, all these years, like I said when we started the interview, all these years maybe leading up to that. I mean, when I read your book, I felt like you were being built, grown, mentored, taught to go do this.
I felt like I felt I was ready. There was no doubt that I felt that I had the experience of being in the 101st, you know, again, 5th time at Fort Campbell, obviously between the 160th and the division. I knew the people that were there at Fort Campbell and the surrounding communities. I knew many of the people that would be working with me. Wow. Yeah, there's this feeling that, okay, I'm ready. This is the time for me, you know, and that doesn't happen much in life, if you know. I mean, you know, at least not in my now 67 years. It doesn't always happen that way. But every now and then, you know, there's a coincidence of your past experiences and your preparation and what reality brings to you, and that was one.
I can relate on a small scale. And you knew when you were taking command, you guys were going to Afghanistan?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I'd known that from well before that. And in fact, it was interesting doing that because I was in a job that allowed me to get into very highly classified. I was the deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center, my previous job, wearing a suit basically, really for 2 years. And and in a sense, it delayed me a little bit going into division command, which was actually great because it allowed me to command the division that I thought the most of, which was the 101st.
Interesting.
But I was able to really look deeply in what was happening there in Afghanistan. The other part of it is being in command for 33 months, which was on the forward portion of that, where the unit had just got back and we were preparing part of the BCTs, the Brigade Combat Teams, to go back to Iraq. Jeez. And the rest of the division is going to come with me, including with the headquarters. And we were going to take over other Brigade Combat Teams, like the great, you know, the 173rd Airborne, you know, Regiment, and many others there when we get into Afghanistan. But I have another period of time, almost 15 months, in which to prepare myself, the division, you know, for what we're going about. What I was missing at that point is that I had not served in Afghanistan prior to that. Served all around the world, many parts of the periphery, but I had not served in Afghanistan. And so I knew I wanted to get into Afghanistan, do a pre-site deployment or pre-site looks. I talk about them in the Marathon War.
Site surveys.
Yeah, so we do 2 of them. And that's how I kind of culminated my preparation, plus all the other things that you hear about in the book. You know, bringing in former commanders, having them talk, former ambassadors, getting very different looks. And I encourage them to come in and throw that proverbial grenade on the thing, you know, on the table and say, okay, you commanders, you're not ready for this. Or
is that common? Do a lot of commanders bring in people, or is that something you just said, I'm going to do this?
Well, I think we were encouraged to bring in thought leaders, basically like that. I mean, there was no doubt about that. You know, whether you know, how I saw it, where I wanted to bring in people that had different views, not necessarily. I mean, I wanted to be challenged.
Sure.
You know, so we brought in people that basically said the Army's fighting this in a really screwed up way, you know, and we listened. Wow. How can we be better?
You know, you actually answered my question. I was going to say, you know, tell me about how you personally prepare. I know you talk extensively about your site surveys, and for those listening, the site survey is when you and I'm sure a small team travel to Afghanistan, see where you're going to go, the conditions, talk to the current battlefield commandos, what's going on, and you do that to just kind of obviously prep and get an education before going there. Yeah.
So, I mean, you can do that at a very strategic level. You know, you can talk about all the different goals you're trying to do. I mean, one of them, though, is right down to the physical extent of being in the military. So I well remember in the 101st, we always had very high physical PT, you know, fitness standards. We did PT 5 days a week, no excuses. I don't care what you were doing. Yeah, and you know, and everybody knew me as a marathon runner anyway, and they knew, you know, and we tried to do it really well. We get there on our first trip, and we go up in a place called Ranch House. And the Black Hawk, the Ranch House is on the side up in this river valley, way up in the north, a long ways from other folks. And the only way to get troops there is to land on top of a house built on tiers, right? And it's an old tiered made out of timbers and some mud. We put one gear down and we get off, and then it's straight up. And I remember we got our body armor on, we got weapons and ammo and things like that, but we're only there for the day. We're not, you know, so it's not like a whole bunch. And they have ropes, and it's icy as we go up. And we finally get up to the camp that's on the top of this mountain, and I don't recall exactly the altitude, probably about 8,000 feet. And I'm looking around at my team, and they are puffing and puffing. And I remember as we were flying out of there, I wrote down a note that basically said, you've got to upgrade even better the physical fitness of the division to get people ready for Afghanistan. So that was a very simple takeaway from being able to be on the ground. Now, I took many other things, talking to the head of the as they call it, the senior intelligence officer from the United States in Kabul and things of that nature. I took away a lot of other things, but that one was one that it was just, you couldn't read about it. You couldn't get it off of a VTC. You had to experience it, armor, body armor, weapons. And two-star generals don't carry a heck of a lot of, grenades and, things like that around. So I knew that other folks were laboring way more than I.
It's not light. It adds some weight to you.
Yeah, it does add a lot of weight, right?
I remember.
But so a lot of lessons learned on that. And I take that in life. I mean, I got to tell you, David, I've long since said that, you know what, if you really want to see things, you need to get on the ground. You need to get out there and talk to people. And so I actually, that's why I spent so much time going out to, we had over 100 outposts, and flying out to them. In many cases, they were being run by a mid-grade NCO and maybe a lieutenant or so. But the number of NCOs where it was only an NCO going out there, and here you are, a two-star general. I wouldn't take an entourage, I had a sergeant or two, a sergeant and maybe a specialist with my PSD that their job was to try to keep me alive. I mean, it's about me wanting to do stuff, and then my aide, basically, And you'd get out there and you'd spend 2 or 3 hours on the ground. I was always very cognizant I'd kick that aircraft out of there because you get mortared.
Attention.
Yeah, I started getting mortared and things like that. But that's how I knew what was actually happening in my division in Regional Command East, was seeing it. It wasn't the BUBs, the battle update briefs that we would get every evening and stuff like that for a period of time. It was seeing things on the ground. And I dare say I still believe that now. When I go out, I'm a businessman, but in the aerospace industry, you got to see things.
I agree. So, speaking of that, talk about your area of responsibility. Chapter 4, page 56. A rough count of total friendly forces in my area of responsibility was about 25,000. To secure a population of between 7 to 10 million and to defeat an insurgency of 7 to 11,000 fighters. Wow, number one. Number two, can you break down just from a high level, east-west, just very high level to somebody who, and I'll be honest, before reading your book, I didn't even understand a lot about Afghanistan. I never went there. I did my short little 6 years and a bit in the Army and got out and kind of just moved on with my life. Always had a lot of honor and maintained some close relationships. But I learned more about Afghanistan from your book in the 2 months I read it than the past 10 years of talking to people and watching the news. But to that point, briefly break down what your area of responsibility is. I know it was up against the border of Pakistan. Why was that a big deal? Right. And then I have a few more detailed questions if you don't mind.
So, I always talk to people about Afghanistan in ways. I try to remind them that, one, Afghanistan's a tough neighborhood. So the former Soviet republics, the stands, are all along the north, the Tajikistan all the way to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. To the west is Iran, no friend, never has been, or for at least in almost my lifetime, since the 50s, 60s, and clearly since '79. And to the south is basically some portion of Pakistan, but the Persian Gulf. It's hugely important strategically for the flow of oil to most of the world. And then all along that eastern border is the 450 miles of border with the frontier of Pakistan. And the Pakistanis had never really been able to secure that area, and so you had this flow of 5 tribes and ethnic groups across the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan, back and forth. The Durand line that was drawn by the Brits 100 years prior to that was never really demarcated, and it caused incredible amounts of issues. To the north through Afghanistan is a small thing called the Hindu Kush. Mountains up into the 19,000 in my area, in the northern part of my area. So it was this area that cuts through Afghanistan and is almost impassable through normal means. There are a couple tunnels that get through there. But so Regional Command East, my area is the size of Pennsylvania, basically. And if you could put it on its side and kind of going up and down.
The size of Pennsylvania with 7 to 10 million local nationals?
Yes. And they are widely dispersed. And so you have some that are very urban. You know, Kabul's right smack in the middle of my sector, basically, but being run by another group. But it's there, and my job is to protect the gates of Kabul. But throughout my area, basically, you have very steep mountains, which are the area of Nuristan and Konar, and they cause the majority of our fighting incidents. And then it goes all the way down to just, it looks like the steppe. You know, think of it as desert, right? And further south towards Kandahar. A very difficult place to be able to have one solution meets all the requirements, right? And so the enemy was different depending upon where you were. And the influence from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups was different. We used to say we were fighting a syndicate, basically. It wasn't just the Taliban, who are, in a sense, insurgents. They got kicked out of the country. They go to Pakistan for safe haven. But they're largely Afghans who want to come back and run the country in Afghanistan and have their own Islamic state. But they don't want to go beyond that. But then you've got Al-Qaeda and other groups, and their goal is to have a transnational solution. It's well beyond Afghanistan.
And these different groups were established in your
Yes, and they're in there, and you know, and during 2001, 2002, most of it gets pushed back out of Afghanistan, but not completely, and they're not destroyed. We don't take the opportunity to destroy Al-Qaeda effectively in 2001 and 2002. Lots been written on that, Tora Bora, et cetera. But so they come back in over time from Pakistan. I'll never forget during one of these PTS, or the pre-deployment site surveys, I go and talk to General McNeil, who is the NATO four-star commander. He's the U.S. commander and had been my boss, you know, back in FORSCOM or 18th Airborne Corps. And he goes, Jeff, you and your boys are going to have quite a fight when you come on in April. And by 2007, 2008, the Taliban and the syndicate of all these other different groups are ratcheting up the violence very significantly, all along that border, but then also around Kandahar, and then clearly down in Sangin and Helmand province.
Do these other groups coordinate with each other?
Loosely. That's why we call it a syndicate. I mean, basically, you know, they had in some cases, they had mutual goals on some things.
Interesting.
The first goal was to get the NATO out, right? And to try to kill as many Americans and NATO allies as our allies as they possibly could. But how they saw the future was obviously very, very different. Yeah, I mean, you had the Pakistani Taliban. They're still there. The Pakistanis are trying to fight them. You know, but then you had the Afghan and Taliban.
So you don't think we did a good job in 01, 02 of just cutting the head off and
I think we did an extraordinary job right off in getting started, and from the start using, you know, our operational detachments or SF units, our outfits to partner with the Northern Alliance. I thought we did an extraordinarily good job there. We didn't go far enough. They did not have enough on the ground, and having been there yourself, I mean, been in the Special Forces, you know, you do really need a large amount of force later if you're going to get into a decisive battle, right? Sure. We did not have enough of that conventional force there, either from aviation or from the ground perspective, to actually do the defeat that we needed. But we had Al-Qaeda.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that.
Yeah.
It's almost like our timing's in sync here. Chapter 7, page 80. A miserable week. So when I had my private time with the ISAF commander, I did not beat around the bush. Sir, I have completed my assessment. I believe we need more resources in RC East. Troops, surveillance, reconnaissance, and close air support. It seemed to be a recurring theme that I took, that you needed more troops. Yes. And just more resources. Also, if you look at it during that time, that was kind of the surge in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken.
It is the surge. You know.
So, I mean, fighting two wars like that, I mean, same theater-ish, mm-hmm. I mean, region of the world, but two separate countries, not exactly bordering each other. I mean, how did we do that as a country, as a military?
So, I mean, our country made a very specific decision to, during the Iraqi surge, which was to defeat Iraq first. During this time frame, you know, 07 and 08. And so Afghanistan became an afterthought. And I think that's pretty cruel. I mean, and I would say that there are a lot of decision makers out there that would say, Jeff, you're going way too far. You're being way too offensive or aggressive on those words. But that's the way I felt. I felt like I was clearly in a theater that was not the priority. And I had my own bosses back in Central Command and the United States Army remind me that we were not the priority. You know, and
did that make you angry at all?
Well, what it did is, David, I mean, I always took command as it was my responsibility to do the very best I could for the mission, but also to take care of my troops. Whether, you know, by then, you know, with the 101st, it's also a combined force. So I have sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guardsmen and civilians working for me. My job was to get the mission done. But I felt like, you know, that we were basically trying to do it with not enough resources, so I couldn't get the job done the right way. And it becomes this mismatch between the mission and then the assets that you have to do it. Yeah, I mean, you see that throughout life, right? But in this case, people will die because of that. And so we won't get the mission done the way we said that we were going to do it to the American people. And it gets back to this resounding theme of making sure that you have support in America, and as well as all the NATO capitals who are supplying troops. And I felt at the time it was time. I called it bet my stars. You know, I mean, I knew that this request was going to be very unpopular. I knew it was coming at a time.
Unpopular in the sense that you're going against what people are telling you, you're requesting something you already know is going to be a no-go. What does unpopular mean?
At the time, I knew that the Army and the Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, I mean, they were already surging, and they were already at the point where you're just about out of Schlitz. For all those folks, that's a beer. I don't think it's made anymore. But you're out of resources, right? And yet I'm asking, and as you know, I ratchet the game up. I go public, you know. I mean, you know, and that's the opportunity a division commander has. But at the same time, my boss knew, and he supported it. My local boss, the 4-star there, General McKiernan, and I was very clear with everybody who would come inside, whether it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who came very frequently, Admiral Mullen, I have a great regard for him, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Gates. I was very clear to them and their staffs once I had made this assessment.
Wow.
Well, later in the book I talk about this it starts off as it's iced, it's a VTC, it's a secure VTC with the Secretary of Defense, and we're briefing them every 2 weeks. And I specifically brief him about Afghanistan. And I believe it was the deputy chairman basically at the time brings this up and says, Jeff, do you want to talk about your request for troops? And at the point there, I really wanted to say, no, sir, I really don't want to talk about it, but I did. And you know, I well remember a very senior person, I talk about it in the book, saying, well, there's not really not enough troops. And then the secretary kind of just breaks the ice. I think it was the secretary, and he basically says, Jeff, ask for what you need. And Admiral Mullen says the same thing. I think it was actually Admiral Mullen said that, and then the secretary said that's exactly right. And it's a fight still through the bureaucracy, but I knew by then that they were giving me the opportunity to call it as I see it. They were trusting me in different ways. It was my job when they came to country, and they did frequently, to show them.
Why?
Show them why, right? And I think that's how we were successful in being able to raise the number of troops. I know there are a lot of folks out there that think that, well, by just adding troops and capability, ISR capability, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, that I was seeing this in a somewhat conventional sense. But in the truth, I was taking total consideration of what my counterparts at the time, first General McChrystal and then Admiral McCraven, what they were doing with the counter-terrorist force, the Special Operations forces that are in the country. And I'm trying to be in sync with them. They're trying to be in sync with what I'm doing, which I own the ground. My commanders own the ground. And I come in many times. I'm thinking about that because we sometimes made enemies. We sometimes attacked the wrong forces. Deliberately so, and some not deliberate from our view. It was deliberately caused on the ground. We settled a fair number of tribal disputes by not knowing what we didn't know what was going on, and we attacked. Thinking they were Taliban.
Interesting.
But I would just say that, you know, there are a few times in life where you have to stand up and be counted. That was one of them. So for me.
Was there a potential backlash though, or
Oh yeah, they could have fired me. I mean, there's no doubt.
why?
I mean,
What am I missing? I
Yeah,
don't get it.
I mean, because basically they would have just said, you know, Schloesser, you're incapable. I lost. You know, they would just say you know, the term is that lost confidence in your ability to command. You know, I mean, and so you know, and I could have done. I could have not asked for more troops, more MRAPs, or you know, ISR aircraft and stuff like that. And I could have muddled through the next 15 months as a commander. I would have lost more soldiers for sure, and we would have been not nearly as effective as I think we were by the time we actually leave there in 2009. I could have gone that way. It was an alternative for me.
Is that the,
and that would have been the easy way.
Yeah. Wow. 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 You say I think you said, if I'm not mistaken, you should have paid a little bit more attention to when they briefed you on the corruption.
Yes.
Chapter 3, page 43. Our combat units could fight, build, teach, govern if necessary, and yes, even be farmers. That was an interesting part when I read that. But we were not organized or trained to fight the corruption so pervasive that it made up a significant part of everyday Afghan life.
Yeah.
Corruption on what level, to who? Everybody? Is it just people wanting money so they're going to turn a blind eye to stuff, or even more attack, or what does that mean?
So corruption's built into Afghan society, and it probably goes back many, many decades. But by the time we're there, for an example, a policeman's very poorly paid. So in any police act that they do that's good, they demand a payback. They demand money to be able to resolve a safety issue. And on the other side, the police could be very negative and do bad things, and the only way to keep them from doing bad things was to actually pay them off as well. This goes throughout the entire society, not just the police. I mean, to get anything done as far as you know, settling a farm incident, trying to get the local government, and again, we're talking about a democratically elected national government who have appointed provincial leaders. Think of them as states, you know, and then districts. Think of those as counties. They are appointed down there, but the bureaucracy. The oil that does the bureaucracy that's running this bureaucracy isn't competence, it isn't taxes, it is basically paying for a service out of your own pocket. And so that level of corruption, and again, the reason why I say it's decades, probably hundreds of years old, is that you have disputes and they eventually get solved by either paying somebody to do something bad to resolve this dispute. And the whole country is basically, it operates on corruption. And so we should not have been surprised here at the end during the Afghanistan, this chaotic withdrawal, when you start seeing outfits with just you know, fold. I mean, part of the corruption is that we were not smart enough to realize that there were ghost soldiers out there. Eventually the reports come out from the Inspector General and things like that, and we know that over time. But you know, outfits would be maybe 60% real soldiers, and then 40% dead dudes, or just names.
Just names on a roster.
Just names on a roster, and that commander, that payroll was coming to that commander, right? And so, and then just think about, you know, equipment being given to the Afghan army. Some of it's being sold off. I mean, weapons, ammo, food.
Yeah, we saw that in Iraq.
You know, yeah, you saw that in Iraq, right? But it's throughout the whole society. It's endemic to the society.
Do you think when the Taliban was controlled, they just kept a lid on it more because they ruled with such an iron fist, per se?
I think that they are trying, and when they were there, they tried to work on corruption, and they did it with just a very, you know, very hard-handed, I mean, you know, way of doing it, which, you know, they would kill you or execute you, cut your hands off, things of that nature. I mean, but they didn't solve it. And then, and of course, the drug money is another whole portion to this whole thing. You know, let's remember, you know, that the largest poppy fields in the world are in Afghanistan. You know, the largest amount of heroin, opium is being produced there. And you saw initially when the Taliban ran it before, before 2001 that they tried to stop the corruption. They tried to stop the production of opium, and it lasted 1 year. And basically, all the farmers were going to rebel against them, and so they let it go again. I dare say you're going to continue to see maybe half-hearted attempts by the Taliban to stop this opium and poppy yet again. But they're going to have to retrain an entire society to get it off of this. And so, you know, probably below all the corruption, it isn't because people are terrible people. It's because they've grown up in a society that is fueled by poppy and requires. I mean, their whole way of life was you know, being oiled by money being passed one way or the other, and not a lot, but enough that it made a difference.
So do you feel, to a certain extent, you talk about corruption, and this may just be fear, actually, more than I think about it, the battle, and was it Wanat? Is that a city?
It's a small town.
It's a small town. You talk about, first and foremost, yeah, I had no clue about that. I mean, when I read that, I literally read, it gave me chills down my arm reading that, and the heroism that we displayed, because we got sucker punched the way I read it. I mean, I think you talk about some lessons you learned about.
Incredible.
So briefly talk about that, because that battle, I mean, the villagers just left and provided almost a safe haven and a staging for the Taliban to come in and attack and pretty much overrun an outpost. And what was that like?
Yeah, so it's again a very remote area. Wanat is a district center, basically up in the high mountains. And what you saw is that we had taken a year to. We were going to reallocate forces there because we thought we were embracing counterinsurgency theory at the time, which by then Petraeus has actually published along with his Marine Corps counterpart, which basically said, live among the villagers, get in there and live there. Very much what you would understand in your background, right? In Special Forces. And so we intended to double down inside this district, which was a very small town, but it was the district center. So it had the police chief, it had a governor, things like a district governor, and things of that nature. And we did it right smack in the middle of town. We negotiated for a year, took a year to be able to get this plot of land, and we moved in there. And normally what you saw when we moved places around, and we did that from time to time, is that the Taliban or the enemy that we were fighting, which was often Taliban and others, would take their time. They would, you know, kind of probe at night and, you know, shoot a little bit, but they would do it from afar before they would actually do a full-scale attack. What occurs here is within days we have a full-scale attack. And very quickly, they have done an excellent job of scouting out what the camp looked like after just a few days of being built. And they took out all the crew-served weapons, right, just like that. Took out the mortars, and basically, at the end of several hours of incredible heroism by this outfit from the 173rd. We lose 9 soldiers, but they have stopped the camp from being overrun. You know, we did the very best we could to put fixed-wing aircraft over the top, B-1 bomber, as well as other aircraft. Apaches took about 25 to 30 minutes to get up there from Jalalabad, but they get there as fast as they can, flying over the mountains, and they make a huge difference fighting danger close. I mean, literally within just meters of this is a U.S. soldier, that's an enemy. It's an incredible fight, but what you see at the end of it, and what you're talking about, David, is that when we get up there, we bring in some Afghan commandos led by Special Forces, U.S. Special Forces, as well as a bunch of reinforcements. We find that the whole city or town had been compromised. The police apparently had abandoned their complete site and the enemy used their facility, basically. The leadership of the town and the district had beat feet. And eventually I arrest the governor. And the people have sent all the mails are gone, essentially, you know. And so that's that level of corruption where we negotiated with them for a full year. We have actual Afghan army with our unit, with this platoon that's in combat. You know, so it's not just a U.S.
Living
outfit.
in the same outpost?
They're at the same outpost. They're fighting,
wow, I didn't
you
know
know. And so to see this happen, and it eventually leads to a strategic decision. I eventually decided not to reinforce this after 2 days, instead to withdraw. And I figured that at the town, we were going to do good things for the town and for the people. We're going to provide input, money, a lot of resources to do things that were necessary in that area, dams and things of that nature. I said, not one more penny up there. And I can't trust the people, so how could I even attempt to try to do counterinsurgency, which is to be with the people in an environment like that?
So here's the locals. You're coming in. We're going to, like you just said, the dams, the schools, we're going to help you build this infrastructure. They basically said no and sided with the Taliban.
Yes. Yeah.
Fear out of the Taliban.
Yes.
They don't want what we want to give them. They don't want to experience the democracy we want to give them. Yeah. What?
A little bit of all that, but fear is a huge player in this area of the world, as well as in a lot of conflicts that have involving counterinsurgency. So the Taliban were wonderfully skilled, wrong term, but they were highly skilled at delivering night notes, which were death threats, and basically saying, if you support the U.S., we'll come after you, and you're going to find your head laying on your wife's doorstep. Jeez. And they would follow that up, right? I mean, and so that actually occurred throughout Afghanistan, where there would be assassinations of that attempt if you became too close to the U.S. and you were in areas that were not 100% secured by either Afghan forces, the Afghan army, or other coalition partners, as well as the U.S. And so the fear is huge, huge. Like that level of corruption, where I'm sure that money greased the skids for a number of folks, including the police and the police chiefs and stuff of that nature. So there's that level of corruption there. Wow. There's probably another thing that's almost intangible, is we did not understand these mountain tribes well. We didn't understand what motivated them. It takes a long time, and I talk about it in the book, where I'm finally calling up the State Department, the agency, and saying, give me your best expert on Nuristan. Because I don't understand the people up there.
Just their mindset? What part of it?
Well, there is basically a series of tribes and sub-tribes, different languages. And I don't understand, in many cases, what's causing their level of pushback against us. Why are they fighting against us? Why aren't they not embracing the Afghan government?
Interesting.
Well, this whole area is known as, in the Nuristan, was known as Kafiristan. It was very late to be forcibly forced into Islam. Before that, they did not believe in that religion at all. They hate outsiders. Essentially,
so they saw us as invaders.
We were invaders no matter what. And it's funny, David. I constantly explain to people about Afghanistan. This is a country that has been invaded so many times. It's part of their history, right? I mean, so 323, Alexander the Great invades Afghanistan. In fact, his camp is at the same place that the Soviets build their camp when they invade, and where we built our camp, Bagram. The first mentions of Bagram are in 323 BC. That's where they wintered overnight, before they went out. Genghis Khan piled up bones and heads and things like that. And then later on, his grandson comes back and does the exact same thing. Many other different invasions prior to then finally the Brits, then the Soviets, and then finally, for many people, they thought we were invaders too. We saw ourselves as liberators after 9/11. Many Afghans saw us invaders. I'll never forget in Nuristan, an old lady comes out. She looked old, but I was probably older than her, giving her a rough life. And she says something in one of the Nuristani dialects. And the interpreter says, she says, don't kill us, you Soviets, you're all alike. Please don't kill us. And to her, we were still the Soviets. I mean, and life hadn't changed since the Soviets had left in 1989, and here we are in 2001. Many of them saw us as invaders.
I'm going to ask about that a little bit later on. One last question about your time in Afghanistan. And I know I'm going to probably get a lot from this myself, but kind of decision making, because you talk about, I say Article 15, I don't know what the term is.
Non-judicial punishment, they call it. Right.
But there's different levels you have to do it. Chapter 13, page 137, over the course of my command in Afghanistan, I fired several officers and NCOs. A handful were clear-cut. criminal actions or violations of the UCMJ. Most were judgment calls, what we commonly call lost confidence in the ability to command or lead. And in these, I wrestled with each case.
Yeah.
So the criminal actions kind of
Easy.
easy,
Yeah,
right?
very easy.
So the other ones, you just lost, they didn't do anything wrong per se, you just lost confidence in their ability to do their job and lead.
That's right. I mean, and, you know, what you're doing at that time as a commander is you're weighing that one person, what has been accomplished so far under their watch, what they're doing, with what you sense is the requirement for them to be successful, and then thus that unit or you to be successful as a commander. And so generally what I found was my expectations were up here and what I saw was down here. And whereas in almost all other environments, if you were not in combat, there was always the potential of training, experience, mentoring, and bringing that person back up to where there was a meeting of the minds about what was necessary to be done and how did you do it. In combat, because of the way things are, people's lives are always in jeopardy. The mission that is, that needs to be done doesn't wear a watch that says you've got 2 months. The mission normally has to be, done from the start. And so what I often felt was I'm weighing lives in some cases up here or the mission against how long will it take me to get this person back, or not back, but to this point.
Standard.
And unfortunately, in many cases, I would have to make the decision that says, I can't get there from here, and it's best that I go ahead and remove that person from that position.
I've always said you never know what you're going to do in combat till you're in combat. I mean, you could talk, I've seen Rambo 100 times, but when the bullets start flying, you never know what you're going to do. I remember being I was 20 years old when I saw my first person get shot, and it was enemy, but it froze me up for a good second or two.
Yeah.
So were some of those decisions, they just couldn't hack it in combat? And I don't want to hack it in any kind of negative sense of the word, but they just couldn't rise to the occasion in those specific real-world situations?
More of them were in the decisions that they made were not sound decisions that would allow that unit to be successful or to keep it out of hot water. So at say junior officer level, or mid-grade NCOs and stuff like that, I'd go out to certain sites, and we had a clear set of standards. I had people, I actually had my inspector general fly even more than I did, and they went to every site and said, these are the 101st standards. Because remember, we're bringing in units from all around the world, in some cases, right? And that's another thing that you lived in within Iraq. But these are the standards. And then we'd give them all the assets that we thought were necessary. But if you'd get out to a site and you would see that the defensive perimeter was absolutely not ready, and you'd ask and you'd talk to, say, that young lieutenant or maybe that staff sergeant, and you could see that they were not prepared to lead that outfit because they didn't know what you were talking about. Then it was time to cut that loss, because there was no amount of time that I could spend with them, or I couldn't spend, their battalion commander say, get down there and train that person for 3 days. It was not going to work, right? And so those were actually really hard, because in a sense I felt, David, that not only had the system failed them, had not taught them the right things. And some of those folks could be wearing Ranger tabs, but it had not translated into on the ground, real live. This is how you prepare. It's one thing to be in a school. It's another thing, as you said, to have bullets flying at you, right? And that hadn't translated. And I felt like it was my job to do the hard thing, and to have a replacement.
Nothing compared to what you did, but what you were saying, I remember my first ever tech startup that I was in, that I founded myself. I had this, MBA, Harvard, Stanford, this, and I thought, we got an MBA, Harvard, we're unstoppable. And it was this first time in an entrepreneurial venture, and I'm like, damn, you ain't cut out for this entrepreneur stuff. You got to go back to the consulting side of the house. But side note, 2 specific circumstances, and we'll close this out back on, because I think these were tough decisions, what I gathered. One was this company commander who you briefly talk about the abuse of detainees that you had to relieve of his command. I get why you did it, support it. Was that tough though for you?
Yeah, I think I lay it out in the book that even later on, in fact, I talk about moral courage, and one, I mean, to put a little more color, as they say on this thing, is this was my best company commander probably, and I mean, and I had a lot of company commanders, and we have not prepared him the right way as far as the assets. He's out there in a tough place, FOB Airborne, getting attacked all the time, doesn't have the support he feels from his battalion that he needs. He frankly tells me so when I'm out visiting it, and I just didn't translate that into movement or to action, right? I didn't go back and pull in his battalion commander and say, there's something here that I'm missing, but you need to go spend time doing what I just did and try to figure this out. But it probably was just, I know, his resources. So he takes on, and he and his first sergeant do these things because they believe there's an insider threat. And so when they do these actions, and they don't kill anybody, but they make people think that they're killing them so that they can get the other detainee to talk, and they do talk, and it helps them to locate, the penetration. But the way they did it, was completely extrajudicial. I mean, basically, everybody thinks he's assassinating people right outside with, and he is firing his weapon, but he's basically shooting it in the ground next to a guy that's over here, and then they take him away, and they don't know what's happening. What I wanted him to do is to say to me, really, this is bad leadership. This is against the law of warfare. I realize I made a mistake, and I've learned a lot from that. The outcome would have been 100% different. He could not do that. Instead, I believe truly that his position was I got to convince my division commander that what I did was courageous and necessary for my troops. And just says he's responsible for a division, I'm responsible for a company, and I'm making the right choice. And that bothers me for the remaining time. It still bothers me because, his career ended, basically, his military career. And I hope he's successful in whatever he's doing. I don't have contact with him. But I know that I changed his entire life.
Wow. And
yet, at the end of the day, I had to admire his courage. He felt he was doing the right thing, and I could understand the logic.
Wow. Wow. That's deep.
Yeah.
Going to foreign military now, my first question before we get into this rapid fire Q&A we're going to do.
Okay.
I always thought, I've had this question for years, and talk about Poland being there, Polish soldiers, you talk about the Italians being there, you talk about even the Italians, maybe rumors they had a truce with the Taliban.
Yeah.
I try to put myself in their shoes. Say 9/11, and hopefully it never happens to anybody, but say 9/11 happens to Italy, God forbid. And here I am, Dave Johnson, serving in the Army. And they said, hey, Dave, you're going to deploy to Afghanistan and go fight this gruesome war because Italy got attacked. I might be like, really? Really? Yeah. I mean, do you think these foreign, do they want to be there? What was there? You worked with them, so what was that kind of environment like?
Well, the difference in Afghanistan is that NATO actually declared basically an out-of-sector mission, and so you had these NATO countries coming on in at the time, plus a lot of non-NATO countries as well. I think that the majority of the soldiers that I talked to and dealt with, both from the leaders all the way down, because again, I commanded both Polish forces, French forces, a variety of other non-NATO countries as well, Latvian provincial reconstruction team. I would talk to their soldiers, and most of them felt like the attack that occurred essentially in not only in New York and Washington, D.C., was an attack not on America, it was an attack on countries around the world that had very similar thoughts about freedom of press, not press, but freedom of the people. They saw it as an attack. I think many of them, especially initially during that first decade of war in Afghanistan, in which we're really talking about, they saw it as an attack against one, but an attack against all.
Wow.
So I don't think many of them felt that way. Now, I could easily see, I can understand what you've just described. You know, I mean, I can understand that soldier out there and from another country, and it's kind of like going, this is a U.S. fight. They got attacked. You know, I'm not into it for this, and therefore I'll make these type of, you know, corrupt types of agreements with the Taliban. You know, there were rumors of that. I never proved that. You know, I did mention that. But I'd say by and large, given the provisos of the governments on their forces, they did pretty well around, you know, the sectors, whether it was the Germans up in the north, the Italians to the west, also just south of me, the UK and the Canadians in the south, Turkish forces and French forces in Kabul, and then obviously the French forces and Poles with me. You know, I talk a lot about the Poles. They were an incredible fighting force, and you know what was interesting there is that they brought a lot of the stuff that they needed to fight. They weren't looking on U.S. Uncle Sam to provide all the weapons and all the vehicles and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they even brought their Mi-24s, which I got to tell you, being an old Cold Warrior in Germany on the Fulda Gap from the 70s, having a Hind fly over the top of me, and it was a good guy, was always striking to me, you know.
They were in Iraq too, right?
They were.
Yeah, they were
absolutely.
up north, I think.
Yeah.
Well, there are some patriotic Americans and some veterans that have some questions for you, sir. The viewers wrote in. Malcolm out of Florida asks, do you ever see a path forward where we would engage with the Taliban in providing anti-terrorism support?
Yes. I think that we will do that against the Islamic State, probably actually doing it on intelligence a little teeny bit, but we can't talk about it. Not that I know, but yes, the answer is yes. Islamic State is so brutal, so much against all the governments around the world. You will see that happen.
So is that kind of like we have a common enemy type theory?
Absolutely, the enemy of, you know that whole story.
Interesting.
You know,
Same viewer. We hear a lot about over-the-horizon capability. No explanation. How realistic is that in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so the over-horizon capability is the idea that we can fight terrorists by not having any assets on the ground, no intel on the ground, no diplomatic presence, no military on the ground, and we're going to use ISR assets and then fighters or bombers, other types of missiles and things like that to take out the terrorists. How realistic? I think it's a real challenge. I think we've demonstrated how hard it is already, and it's really very easy to do the worst case, which is to kill the wrong people by mistake. And by the way, what you do then is you inform your target how to change their lifestyle so that they can avoid. And so you actually, it's a double negative, right?
Wow.
It's really hard. People are going to talk about it with a big hand on a little map. It's hard.
There you go, Malcolm. Marine Corps veteran, Iraq veteran, Angelo from Florida. Should we look at the Taliban as an actual authoritative source?
Yes, I mean, I think so. I mean, you know, let's look at this. This is an organization or a group that basically has a religious foundation to it, but they want to rule Afghanistan, enough so that they fought for 20 years. Should they be authoritative? Yeah, they're going to be authoritative. They're going to be, you know, you're not going to see a democracy in Afghanistan as long as the Taliban are there. But what you are going to see is that they are kind of trying to do what, given their beliefs, they are going to try to make a better country. They are not prepared to do so unless they co-opt some of the former Afghans that have been trained over these last 2 decades by us.
Wow. And then a lot of people, I think you've probably been asked this, or how would you have handled the departure and withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Yeah, so first I would not have withdrawn.
Interesting.
I believe, and I just want to say, you know, I'm a product of my own things, but I was a baby in the Army of Occupation in Germany, okay? I mean, all the pictures of me in 1954 and 55 as a toddler are on rubble. That's 9 to 10 years after the end of World War II. It takes a long time. The U.S. Army is in there as an Army of Occupation still in Germany in 1954. We still have forces in Germany. We still have forces in Japan. We have forces in Korea after that conflict. We have forces, not many, but some in Kosovo. Around the world, the reason why we have forces is not to be benevolent. We're not out there to provide a service to those countries. We are there for our national security reasons. In some cases, they have to do with the security of that country, maintaining the security of that country. My belief is for a relative handful, a percentage of, you know, basically we were down to very close to between 2,500 and 6,000 soldiers, sailors, Marine, airmen, and others on the ground. That would have made good sense for us, and that enabled our NATO allies to keep almost 10,000 more troops there, and it enabled the Afghan army and the government not to fold. I would not have left.
Wow. Thank you. Rob from Hawaii asks, what lasting effort did your command and the war in Afghanistan have in promoting long-term democracy?
Yeah, so I mean, that is probably that's probably the biggest question out there when you take a look at it. So why did this government fold so fast once the Army started to fold? And the Army one, you could have easily seen that happen over a period of time, because you saw they took away the U.S. backbone, the NATO backbone. They no longer had air. They no longer had logistics. What did you expect? You know, to see that Army was going to fold. The government folding as fast as it did meant that we did not do. And so I'm going to take the opposite tack and tell Rob. What we didn't do, Rob, is we did not build institutions that had all the way down to the local level enough support from the people to maintain governments in that country once that lifeline was cut off of either logistics from the U.S. or whatever. So we failed.
They couldn't self-sustain.
They could not self-sustain. So that's what we did not do. The second thing we did not do is we did not address the incredible corruption what we've already talked about in that country. What we did do is we gave a dream of self-governments, a dream of education that would result in entrepreneurs, in musicians, actors, journalists, TV shows. We gave a dream to an entire generation, and you can't kill that dream. They have it in the Afghans that are stuck in Afghanistan, the people that are in this huge diaspora that are coming to the United States and NATO countries and elsewhere throughout the world. They have that same dream.
Tasted it.
And whether we did that purposely or just by sheer being with us and watching us for not only my division's 15 months but others, I think that is the most critical thing. We gave a dream to an entire generation of Afghans.
Well said. A couple more. Kevin from California asks, when were you ever faced with major orders, major in bold, you disagreed with? What type of disagreement was it? Moral, ethical, tactical, and what did you do?
Yeah, so I think it's probably what we've already talked about is that my orders to go in there were to take what I had, roughly 25,000 troops, and the assets that we had brought in and do the very best I could. And no commander sat down and said, these are your orders, and that do the very best you could. But that was the underlying theme of everything, right? And so basically, I chose not to disobey them. I chose to try to change them, which is by asking for more assets initially through my chain of command, very clearly enunciating it, and then very clearly going public. And so, it's with the VTCs, I had routine, large VTCs with the Defense News or with the Pentagon. And that's where I went public in this. So it's in a sense, it was not a major, I'm disobeying your order or anything like that. Instead, it's, well, you've given me a mission. I can't accomplish it, in my opinion, in a way that the American people can support. And therefore, I'm going to try to increase what I need to actually accomplish the mission. And so it wasn't disobedience, but it was a way of saying, I understand what you've told me to do. This is what I think I'm going to do. It's maybe painful for all of us, and it was for me, but we're going to go forward this way.
Wow.
Again, betting the stars.
Two more. Will from Phoenix, actually a former 101st guy. I know this person. In a counterinsurgency operation, our forces rely heavily on local nationals to be translators and serve various support functions, but there is an implicit promise that we will protect them by virtue of them agreeing to help us. After Afghanistan, do we have the credibility necessary to enlist locals to assist us.
Yeah, Will's right. I mean, and, in fact, a lot of us vets are still trying to help get Afghans back out of that country that deserve to get out of the country because they've supported us, not only as translators, interpreters, working in all of our areas as far as they took over entire functions in many cases and actually had a career out of it. Some intelligence operatives, I can go on. The list is huge, right? All of their families are, in fact, also in jeopardy. And in fact, some are being hunted down today and being assassinated, and their families are being imprisoned or impoverished at the very least. We owe them, it's not a ticket to get out of the country. It is, we owe them a future. And in most cases, that has to be outside of Afghanistan, given the situation right now. Will it hurt us in the future? I think those folks that actually take a hard look at Afghanistan will be very hesitant for a period of time before they sign on to support us. That said, in the history of warfare, what you see is that most people have a very short memory, and these things will be forgotten,
Which we briefly talked about in one of our phone calls prior to this. It's no longer in the news anymore, and it's not forgotten to a lot of people, but to a lot of major.
Yeah, like I wrote in the book. I mean, it's America can forget about Afghanistan. Afghanistan won't forget about us. That's true in so many different layers, right? I mean, and I talk about it as far as counterterrorism. In other words, folks like Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan come hunting us. But the truth is, there's far more about it. The people of Afghanistan will remember our generosity. They will remember the things that they learned from us. And so no matter what, no matter how mad, how angry they are at America right now because we left them behind, what do they want to go? Where do they prefer to go? They want to get out of Afghanistan, and most want to come to America. To them, it's a dream. And it's one it's not slightly tangible at this point in time. Do we owe them a chance of trying to do it? Yeah, we do.
Last one, Scott from Phoenix. Just in life, you go in with expectations. You come out with reflections. What do you currently reflect on?
Yeah, so I mean, when I reflect backwards, I feel like this was a mission that we never quite accomplished, right? I mean, and so as just look at it as American or NATO troops, you go in and you fight for what is 2 decades. For me, my son fought there as well. I tell the story, my dad actually went there after he retired back in right after 2001 and helped try to set up the Ministry of Defense as a military contractor. 3 generations in this war. As I reflect back, I feel anguished. I'm really upset about the way we withdrew. I understand that, that we have limited assets and we're trying to focus them on China and things of that nature, but I feel like we took a country that, to use a term from General Colin Powell, if you go into a China shop, you break it, you own it, right? And he was talking about warfare. So we went into Afghanistan, and it was already deeply broke, but we reset it in a way that looks more like NATO and more like America as far as the forces and things of that nature and the government. And yet now we left it in a one can say in a disastrous shape. So that is the reflection, anguish. The other part of it is that I am still hopeful again for this generation of young Afghans, that actually learned that they could have a future. And I think over time, you're going to see some of them again. I don't know what will happen in Afghanistan, but there's no doubt in my mind that Afghans will try to be leaders, entrepreneurs, business people, noted diplomats around the world, from a variety of different organizations. And so I want to say we did some things good, and I will have to say that at the end of the day, we didn't get attacked by Al-Qaeda over the last 2 decades. And so that makes a lot of difference for our country and all of our NATO allies as well.
Wow.
But those are simple reflections, anguish, a little bit of hope, and still in my mind a whole lot more to accomplish.
Wow. Well, sir, one thing I took away a million things from your book. You really cared about everybody that you commanded.
No,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.